Hey everyone, Lori Spencer here. Welcome back to the dark side of RFK Jr. We're working our way through Jerry Oppenheimer's book, RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Dark Side of the Dream. And we're up to episode 16. Wow, what a decade we've covered. In episodes 14 and 15, we talked about that turbulent decade of the 1990s, and we're finally to the end of that decade. We're going to talk about the loss of JFK Jr. in 1999, the only surviving son of President Kennedy, Caroline Kennedy's late brother. And if you're reading along with me in the hardcover edition of the book, we're jumping in today on page 316, Chapter 33, Another Catastrophe. The horrific decade of the 1990s, beset by scandals and tragedies involving the third generation of Kennedys, had ended with still another catastrophe, but also a $250,000 windfall for Bobby. Around 8:30 p.m. on Friday, July 16, 1999, 38-year-old JFK Jr., at the controls of a Piper Saratoga PA-32-2, and with his wife Carolyn and her sister Lauren Bessette belted in as passengers, took off from Essex County Airport in Fairfield, New Jersey, en route to Martha's Vineyard. There, Kennedy had planned to drop off his sister-in-law and then fly on to Hyannisport, where his cousin Bobby's baby sister, Rory, was to be married on Sunday, July 18th. It was not a good night to fly. As another pilot who was at the airport when the Kennedy party arrived noted, quote, "The weather was very marginal, 4 to 5 miles visibility, extremely hazy." That pilot, who had also planned a flight to the Vineyard, decided the weather wouldn't cooperate and smartly canceled his trip. Kennedy was a neophyte in the air. He had logged no more than a reported 200 hours flying time. Hold on a second. I have to stop because the author got that one wrong. And I have to point out, he had been flying for several years. He just didn't get his private pilot's license until 1998. He had received high-performance airplane and complex airplane endorsements about 2 months before the crash, and his estimated flight hours before that crash was 310 hours to be exact, of which 55 hours were at night. Okay, back to the book. Moreover, he was used to piloting a much smaller plane, a Cessna 182, compared to the larger, high-performance Piper Saratoga. And just a month earlier, he had broken his ankle and was still recuperating. Despite everything, he was determined to make this trip. The bags were packed and the plans had been made for a joyful weekend with his family at the Kennedy compound. But an hour out of New Jersey, over the Atlantic Ocean, and not far from the coast of Martha's Vineyard, Kennedy's plane disappeared. Most of the clan had already gathered and had retired for the night when notification arrived that John's plane was missing. Bobby, for one, was awakened by his sister Carrie at 3 a.m., and told the horrific news. Quote, "I knew then that John was dead," he wrote in his diary that was leaked and became public in 2013. Quote, "The water was 68 degrees, so some people had hoped they might still be alive, but I had none." Earlier in the evening, Bobby and his wife Mary had planned to spend some quality time with John and Carolyn, aware of some problems the couple was facing. A week before, Mary had visited them in their chic downtown Manhattan loft and learned from gorgeous 33-year-old Bessette-Kennedy that her husband was, quote, "so depressed," as Bobby noted in his diary, regarding some infighting involving John and his sister Caroline. They had been battling over pieces of their mother's furniture that had been left to them, along with Mrs. Onassis' spectacular Vineyard country home, Redgate Farm. John, Bobby noted in his diary, confided to me also about how hurt he was by Caroline's actions, which he didn't describe. A 1996 Sotheby's auction of some of Mrs. Onassis' things, a sale that had been the former First Lady's idea before she died, had raised $34 million. But when the dust settled, stated JFK Jr.'s close friend, Rob Littell, quote, John and Caroline received less than $100,000 each after auction fees and taxes owed on the estates. It was, Littell asserted, a far cry from the millions they were reported to have received. Littell remembered the moment Kennedy received his check. After all that, the multi-millionaire JFK Jr. sputtered, "This is what we get, less than $100,000. Another issue that John faced that appeared to be depressing him, according to Bobby's diary, was criticism that he had received from his Uncle Ted for inviting the Hustler magazine founder and publisher Larry Flynt to be his guest at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, a prestigious dinner in Washington for celebrities, comics, media stars, and politicians. Bobby wrote in his diary that the senator had sent his nephew a disappointed letter, and John felt terrible because his family is so important. Because of the problems that were facing John and Carolyn, Bobby and Mary had decided to, quote, go see them this weekend and spend a lot of time with them, Bobby wrote in his diary. On the night before Rory Kennedy's wedding rehearsal dinner, the Robert Kennedy Jr.'s had made several attempts to visit John and Carolyn at their house in the Kennedy compound, the last time as late as 11:30 p.m., but they still hadn't arrived. Only the housekeeper and a friend were there, and dinner was still waiting for them. 3.5 hours later, Bobby learned that their plane was missing, and he knew instinctively that all were dead. Unknown at the time, but according to Bobby's diary, even before the bodies were recovered, a battle was brewing between the Kennedy and Bessette families over burial plans. Bessette's mother, Anne Freeman, had wanted burial near the family home in Greenwich. Bobby wrote that, quote, she wants them close by and is terrified that the Kennedy family might try to spirit them off to Brookline, Massachusetts. He was referring to the cemetery in the Boston suburbs where his brother Michael had been buried just 18 months before, and where his brother David and Joseph Kennedy, the Kennedy patriarch, and Rose Kennedy, the Kennedy matriarch, had been interred. Bobby revealed in his diary that a meeting was arranged in New York, attended by Caroline Kennedy's husband, Edwin Schlossberg, and Ted Kennedy's wife, Vicki Reggie, to hash out this burial controversy. And Bobby made a startling disclosure in his diary. He wrote, all the Bessette family knows that Ed hated Carolyn and did everything in his power to make her life miserable, and he bullied the shattered, grieving mother. At the tense meeting in New York, Bessette's mother was told, according to Bobby's diary entry, that JFK Jr. would be buried in the family plot, and they could do with Carolyn as they pleased. In the end, however, it was decided that the crash victims would be cremated and buried in the sea that had claimed their lives. Some 3 miles from where Kennedy's plane crashed, the USS Briscoe, a Navy destroyer, committed their ashes to the ocean as part of a Roman Catholic ceremony witnessed by 17 mourning relatives of the victims, among them Kennedy's cousins, Bobby and William Kennedy Smith, and Kennedy's sister Caroline, along with 2 Navy chaplains and a Catholic priest. It had been John Kennedy Jr.'s expressed desire, family members said, that he be buried at sea. In his diary, Bobby wrote, when they let go of the ashes, the plume erupted and settled into the water and passed by in the green current like a ghost. We tossed flowers onto the ghosts. Some of the girls tossed letters from a packet they'd assembled from John and Carolyn's friends. It was a civil violation, but the Coast Guard let it go. He wrote that a Navy band had played, quote, mournful music, and we all cried like babies. At the funeral reception, his Uncle Ted danced his silly Teddy dances and sang loudly and beautifully and made everyone love him, Bobby wrote. But Bobby also made pointed references to his late cousin John's brother-in-law, Ed Schlossberg, Caroline's husband. He noted that At the service for the Bessettes in Greenwich, he had tried to get through as a good soldier and making only positive comments and thoughts about Schlossberg. But Bobby stated that at one point at the church in New York, Schlossberg stopped Bobby from delivering a eulogy. According to Bobby, the one surviving Bessette sister, Lisa, was told by Ed Schlossberg, "Kennedys don't eulogize non-Kennedys," a reference to her dead sister. Bobby added another reference to Schlossberg. He wrote that the wife of John Jr.'s close cousin, Anthony Radziwill, who died of cancer a month after the plane crash, had called to discuss what she characterized as Schlossberg's despotic and arrogant behavior. She says she wants to start an I Hate Ed club. There would be many, many members. John and Carolyn would certainly have applied. That's what Bobby wrote in his diary. JFK Jr. and Ed Schlossberg had once gotten into a heated dispute after Schlossberg had inserted himself, uninvited, into a project for the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington. Once dubbed by Spy magazine Mr. Caroline Kennedy and, quote, Camelot's egghead in residence, Schlossberg sought to be involved in making a film about JFK's role in the arts. When JFK Jr. heard about it, he was furious, even though in the past he had gotten along with Schlossberg. It was all he could talk about, Rob Lytell later recalled. He went on and on and on about how Ed should have consulted with him and questioned whether Ed should have been involved in the project anyway. He saw Ed's involvement in the tribute as poaching. The two of them sparred for a bit, which resulted in the project's cancellation. In late July of that very tragic year, 1999, the eve of the new millennium, Bobby Kennedy, a multimillionaire many times over from all of his inheritances and trusts, received a bittersweet surprise. His cousin John had unexpectedly named him in his will to the tune of $250,000. "I cried," he wrote in his diary after receiving the gift. "I've lost a good friend." And that's the end of that chapter, very short chapter. Bobby Kennedy Jr. and JFK Jr. were said to have been very close. And as he wrote, he lost a good friend when JFK Jr. died. But no love lost between Bobby Kennedy and Caroline Kennedy, JFK Jr.'s sister. As you've no doubt seen recently in the news, when Bobby Kennedy Jr. was going through his confirmation hearings in front of the Senate for the position of Secretary of Health and Human Services, Caroline Kennedy actually wrote a letter and put it into the congressional record to the Senate, asking them to vote no on his confirmation. And we talked about that in a previous episode of this podcast series, where she called him a predator and said that he would be disastrous for the country if confirmed as the secretary. But her pleas apparently fell on deaf ears. Kennedy is now our Secretary of Health and Human Services, and how that's all going to turn out, well, that's one for the history books. This will be a short episode today. I'm just going to call it right there. And in our next episode, episode 17, we'll come back with chapter 34 and get into the unfortunate story of Mary Richardson Kennedy, their divorce, and her suicide. So until next time, take care of yourselves. I'll see you then. I'm Lori Spencer. Thanks for listening.